Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon and welcome to the Iowa City Foreign Relations program featuring guest speaker Anam Zakaria. Thank you to all of you who have joined us online today. I am Peter Gerlach, ICFRC's Executive Director and your host for today's program. ICFRC wants to acknowledge and thank its annual donors, members, sponsors, and partners for their support. This list includes the Iowa Arts Council through the Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs, Humanities Iowa and the National Endowment for the Humanities, the University of Iowa's International Programs, Honors Program and Public Policy Center, the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization, Midwest One Bank, Taxes Plus, and City Channel 4 for providing online access to ICFRC's programs along with the UI Library Archives. ICFRC has adopted the Native American Land Acknowledgement prepared for the City of Iowa City's Ad Hoc Truth and Reconciliation Commission and Human Rights Commission. ICFRC recognizes that our home community of Iowa City now occupies the homelands of Native American nations to whom we owe our commitment and dedication. The full text of ICFRC's acknowledgement is on its website at icfrc.org. As we get started, I would like to cover some Zoom etiquette tips. This is the time to make sure you know where your video and audio mute and unmute buttons are located. You are already muted, so we ask you to keep your audio turned off for the duration of the presentation so that you do not interrupt the speaker. If you want to keep your video on, that's great, but we ask that you do your best to not use any distracting movements or behaviors. Following our speaker's presentation at about 12:45, we'll have a 15-minute Q&A. You'll be able to submit your questions via the chat function. At that time, if you have not done so, we invite you to turn your video on, but please keep your audio muted to avoid any background noise. Okay, I would now like to introduce Anam. Anam Zakaria is the author of 1971, A People's History from Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India. Between the Great Divide, A Journey into Pakistan-administered Kashmir, and The Footprints of Partition, Narratives of 4 Generations of Pakistanis and Indians, which won the 2017 KLF-German Peace Prize. Anam is also the co-founder of Qissa, the home of storytelling, and writes frequently on issues of violence, memory, narrative making, and the construction of the other. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, CBC, The Hill Times, and Al Jazeera, among other media outlets. She is currently based in Toronto. With that, please join me in welcoming Anam, who will talk about narrative making and the politics of juxtaposition. The floor is yours, Anam.
Thank you so much, Peter. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. And a big thank you to the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council for hosting this conversation. I'm very excited and also very honored to be speaking with all of you today. Before I begin, just to give you some context to today's conversation, when Peter asked me to come and present, I thought a lot about what angle of my work I wanted to focus on. And I realized it was this. And the reason is that over the past decade, I've been documenting people's histories, oral histories, largely in South Asia, more recently in Canada as well. But alongside documenting these oral histories, I've also been studying these micro histories against the larger macro histories that states craft and perpetuate. And over time, I've become increasingly interested in how narratives are crafted, how they are furthered, how they may be altered over time, or even censored based on what histories are convenient or inconvenient to nation states. Narratives, I've come to realize over time, rarely exist on their own. They don't just emerge out of nowhere. They're shaped as much by how we want others to perceive us as they are shaped by how we perceive those who we do not see as us, those beyond our borders, whether real or imagined. Thus, comparison or juxtaposition, I feel, becomes very paramount, very, very significant to narrative making. And to demonstrate what I mean, and some of my thought process and thinking behind this, I'll be talking today about South Asia, particularly in the context of India and Pakistan. And I'll also be talking about North America, mostly Canada, and its juxtaposition to the US. Now, I'm quite aware that the political, geographic, economic, social realities of these two places, North America and South Asia, are entirely unique. And in no way can you kind of lift one context and just apply it to another. But I do think that the two serve as very interesting contrasts, which show not only very different types of narrative making, but also how essential narratives and as part of that comparisons or juxtaposition become despite the vast differences between South Asia and North America. I'm just going to pause my video for 1 second and turn on the light. We're having a little bit of a thunderstorm, so I feel like it's going to get very dark behind me. Just give me 1 moment. So firstly, the why of narrative making. Why are narratives even important or significant in the first place? Well, narratives can be very, very essential in crafting or creating an origin or a founding story of a nation. Why are we here? Who are we? How do we define ourselves? These narratives enable nations to define how they want others to see them, as well as how they want to perceive themselves. Narratives, myths, stories, whatever we may refer to them as, can also be essential in building a sense of national identity, to say, well, this is who we are, and to define the parameters of national unity, to say these are the people or the geography that defines us vis-a-vis others. Now, inevitably, in some ways, when we define the parameters of what counts as us, what we end up doing is also defining who is not us, who lies beyond those parameters. This is another way of saying when we define us, we also end up defining them, the other, whoever that may be. Borrowing the words of Alex von Tunzelmann, who's the author of Fallen Idols, national stories may encompass science, the arts, or religion, yet they're rooted in history. They create a narrative of how a nation uniquely was formed. It's the nation's unique story. These stories are always exceptionalist, suggesting that our nation is different from, as well as usually superior to, others. They're intended to exclude as much as they're intended to unite. I think that's something important to keep in mind. That's something that I think a lot about in terms of narrative making. The narratives are not only exclusionary, but they also embed within them the sense of moral superiority, the sense of being better than somebody, someplace, some people. Now, in the context of India, Pakistan, in the context of South Asia in particular, this us versus them narrative making is very, very heightened, especially for India, Pakistan. As a lot of you may be familiar in this room, the two nations share very hostile relations. Since the 1947 partition of British India and the creation of Pakistan, the two countries have fought multiple wars. There's a lot of jingoism. There's a lot of talk of war, even when there isn't a war happening at the border. Relations are very, very hostile. It's known as one of the most dangerous borders in the world as well. And it's a place, both India and Pakistan, where how patriotic or quote unquote nationalistic you are is in many ways defined by how much you hate those across the border, how much hatred you have for Pakistanis as an Indian, how much hatred you have for India as a Pakistani, how hostile is your lens. And so when the other is the enemy beyond the border, then you get to define yourself in opposition to that enemy. And therefore, the national narratives in India and Pakistan then also become premised upon these otherizing and often very dehumanizing views of each other. To be Indian becomes everything to be Pakistan, everything Pakistan is not, and to be, Pakistan or Pakistani is everything India is not. They use each other to define themselves. So in the Indian national imaginary, India is shining, it's democratic, it's tolerant, it's pluralistic. And against this, Pakistan in the national imaginary of India emerges as fundamentalist, authoritarian, backward. When you go across the border in Pakistan, where I grew up, In the national imaginary, Pakistan is everything India is not. It is pious, it is righteous, it is fair. And in the Pakistani national imaginary, India then emerges as quote unquote infidel, as draconian, as well as oppressive. Now, this has even led some analysts, some writers and journalists to argue that India and Pakistan both need each other to exist in the form that they do today, in the forms in which they define themselves, in the way in which they want the world to see them. For India, Islamophobic and reductionist tropes about Pakistan, where Pakistan can only be seen through the prism of fundamentalism or terrorism, allows India to emerge as superior in its own self-image. This becomes even more obvious during moments of political unrest, especially during election. For instance, in the 2019 elections that took place recently in India, analysts noted how nationalist fervor was stirred and government criticism deflected by fanning anti-Pakistan sentiment, by uniting the electoral base by saying, this is the enemy and the government will protect you against this enemy. So the enemy image, conjuring that up, becomes very, very important to uniting people within India. On the other side of the border in Pakistan, separation from India in 1947 becomes an integral part of the national story as well as a birth story of Pakistan, because Pakistan emerges from the partition of British India. And this is, I think it's also really important to keep in mind that in the context of Pakistan, there's not much emphasis on colonial history. That's a past that we still really, really need to reckon with. Growing up, I didn't really know much about British colonization and its everlasting kind of impact. I've also worked as an educator in Pakistan, particularly working with high school students, and I noticed that that hasn't really changed. So, for instance, on Independence Day, which is in August, if you ask students, what are you really commemorating or celebrating? A lot of them don't know that it's decolonization. It's a process of independence from the British Empire. Rather, they think it is separation from quote unquote Hindu India, out of which this Muslim nation emerges. So in this context where, colonial history is really not acknowledged, what ends up happening is that the violence of 1947 gets framed as a Hindu-Muslim violence and as a purifying violence, as a violence in which territory, lives, and women's honor, quote unquote, was sacrificed to attain a pure land, a land rid of infidel impurities of Hindu India. Now, I'm quite aware, I worked a little bit on both sides of the border, and I'm really aware that both Pakistan and India struggle with many of the issues that each nation is bent on emphasizing for the other. Pakistan has had a long struggle with militancy, with military dictatorships, and military dominance even continues and continues to influence present-day democracy in Pakistan. On the other side, in India, there's a long track record of violence against minorities under state patronage and draconian policies in Kashmir, as well, which are only, I feel, recently starting to get some more global attention. I don't know if everybody followed the news of the recent BBC documentary that's come out about the Modi government, which has also been banned within India. But this is more recent, this global attention to what's happening in India. Pakistan, of course, received much of it after 9/11. But when India and Pakistan invoke these very real challenges that the two nations face, they're not necessarily doing it from the lens of let's create awareness or let's create systemic change. Rather, they're viewing each other through this lens to deflect from their own challenges, preventing an introspection, a reckoning, a recognition, and giving themselves a pass or a pat on the back to say, well, at least we're better than you. Look across the border, be grateful that you're Pakistani, or be grateful that you're Indian. At least you're not them. Now, narratives are essentially words, they're essentially perceptions, they're images, but they have very, very real impact, on-ground impact. And where you see this particularly in the context of India-Pakistan is in Kashmir. This is a photo of Neelam Valley in Pakistan-controlled Kashmir. This is taken from there, and opposite you can see Indian-controlled Kashmir. And if you see this water, this river that you see, the Neelam River, actually serves as the de facto border or the line of control, as it's called in Kashmir. So the two regions are, they're kind of extremely close to each other. And in fact, I know divided families who actually sit on opposite sides of this river and even talk to each other, but they're not able to cross because of how hostile the borders are. Now, what happens in Kashmir is that the struggle for freedom or the struggle for independence gets framed by India as Pakistan's state-sponsored terrorism. And this is significant because the minute we use the term terrorism, a people's movement for rights becomes depoliticized. And what happens as a result of that is that any policy, any kind of action that India takes, whether that's the disappearance of journalists, whether that's the arrest or torture of activists, it gets framed as a crackdown on terrorism. In the process, people's movement becomes depoliticized, delegitimized, and finger pointing continues. Now, while local journalists and newspapers are cracked down upon, so you don't really often get to hear the narrative of Kashmiris in their own voice, India crafts its own narrative. So whereas, local newspapers are shut down and journalists are kind of censored, human rights abuses are happening, India crafts its own narrative to further on Kashmir. And as part of this narrative, comparison or juxtaposition plays a very, very essential part. Now, here's a story that you can see on the screen from last year, and it's quote unquote on the progress of women in Jammu and Kashmir, Indian side of the line of control. And this progress, as you'll notice from the headlines over here, is very much in contrast or contrasted to the apparent state of affairs of women in POK, which is how India refers to Pakistan-controlled or Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, as well as China, which too controls a part of Kashmir. Now, this was very interesting for me when I saw these headlines, because the story that these news reports reference to is actually a story that I had written about women on the Pakistani side of the line of control. It's a story of sexual abuse that happens in bunkers when Indian and Pakistani armies are shelling at each other, families who are sandwiched. You saw the image of Kashmir that I just showed you. So the Indian army post and the Pakistani army post, and they shoot mortar shells across. And the villages that are just sandwiched in between. So the families would have to rush to bunkers, and bunkers are really, really expensive. The material is very expensive to build a bunker, and only very few families are actually able to do so. So what ends up happening is that most people either have to seek refuge with a more affluent neighbor or in some kind of community shelter. And as we know, sexual violence is very prevalent in conflict zones. And so many women and children particularly were being subjected to it. And they were calling for the government to build more individual bunkers, which is a demand which continues present day. Now, this is a story I wrote about. And of course, this is a story about very, very real struggles of women that are grave. But what happens when the same story becomes appropriated or weaponized, not for the purpose of justice or awareness to say that women in Kashmir are facing these challenges, what are we doing about them, but rather to indicate that the problem lays there. The problem lays on the opposite side of the border, not here. Don't look here. This deflection or this narrative making that you see in those headlines is completely in opposition to the ground reality. It really couldn't be further from the ground reality. In 2018, the United Nations issued its first ever human rights report on Kashmir, and it raised chronic impunity for sexual violence as one of the key concerns. Other media reports that you see over here just provide another small glimpse into the ground reality that's being faced by Kashmiris on the Indian side of the line of control. This deflection, though, is not necessarily new. In fact, even when the UN report was released, India rejected it. And in the process, of course, it also rejected any of the human rights violations or concerns that were raised by the UN. Instead, it claimed that the focus needed to be on Pakistan and the human rights abuses there. It was Pakistan that required full attention. Now, I find this interesting because Pakistan does require attention. I'm somebody who's worked on the Pakistani side of the line of control, and I've written about the human rights concerns on that side. There are a lot of grievances, there are a lot of struggles, there are also human rights violations that absolutely need attention. But the challenge is, when those issues are used to create either a false equivalency to say, well, it's as bad on both sides, or to deflect or even neutralize the situation or the ground reality in Indian-held or Indian-controlled Kashmir. India isn't alone in doing so. In Pakistan, as the UN report also mentioned, and in my own personal work as well, you notice that the violations are of a very different magnitude, very different scale. They're also much more structural. So the issues of repression of freedom of expression, there are issues of the misuse of anti-terrorism laws to arrest protesters and activists. But these issues, when you want to raise attention or talk about them, the Pakistani state is very, very uncomfortable as well. And Pakistan deflects from them by finger pointing at India. When I began my research several years ago, a senior politician in the then incumbent government told me not to do the research at all. The real issue, I was told, was on the other side. Why do you even want to look here? And in fact, I was warned that what I would write about would become appropriated, which, as I shared, has been my experience. It has been weaponized and appropriated very selectively and instrumentalized to minimize issues in Indian-held Kashmir. But I asked myself as a writer, as an oral historian, is the solution to stop bringing attention to these issues, or is the way forward to kind of peel through these statist, larger macro narratives, these popular narratives that tend to completely obscure people's lived reality and instead turn back to people's narratives, to people's voices. This is something that I've been doing. I've been looking at oral histories, which I really feel can provide a different, a much more nuanced, a much more complex lens into a very complicated reality on ground. I'm going to borrow some words here. This quote that says, the state promotes and repeats its national historical narrative and further visions so often that they almost seem natural. Yet memories of events differ among those that the state considers the other. When I was doing oral history interviews in Kashmir, I mostly worked on the Pakistani side. I only worked on the Pakistani side of the line of control. But what I did have an opportunity to do was interview people who had come from the Indian side. They had escaped the violence over there and had become refugees, essentially, had become displaced people. And years later, decades later, when I met with them, were living in very deplorable conditions in camps. So I was able to talk to them and kind of hear their stories. And then I was able to interview people on, who were from the Pakistani side of the line of control as well. And what I'm going to do over here is actually lean on their words. So these are stories that are documented of torture by the Indian state that the refugees had been through. Some of them showed me the physical scars and wounds. Others were sharing memories of their own persecution or of those of families left behind. So there are many divided families, as I mentioned, that sit by the river and talk to each other. I will say that these are very violent narratives. So just wanted to give a heads up to everybody in the room, a little bit of a trigger warning. So this interview is in a camp with this man who had moved several years ago to Pakistan and still longs to go back to his village, which is now in Indian-controlled Kashmir. And he says, the whole issue started in 1989, after the 1987 elections were rigged. By 1990, the Indian army had started to crack down on the locals. They would come to your home, drag you out, arrest you, interrogate you. I was arrested more than once. One of the women in the camp interrupts him and says, tell them what they did to you. Tell them why we left. The anger in her voice is palpable. He goes quiet for a moment and looks down towards the floor, as if contemplating how much to share. We are all silent for a while, waiting to see what he will say next. Then he lets out a long sigh and shakes his head. When he begins to speak again, he looks as if he's in physical discomfort. They would make me stand in cold water and then force me to raise my hands. If I got tired after hours and hours of standing like that and tried to lower my arms, they would beat me up. They would hit me on my knee. Should I show you? I hesitatingly nod, and he rolls up his shalwar to reveal a deep gash. They cut me here and put salt inside. Then they would electrocute me in sensitive areas. What do I tell you, sister? How do I tell a woman what I've been through? The current was so strong that a person would jump all the way up and come crashing down. That's how strong it was. What all do I tell you, sister? He lets out a long sigh and then falls quiet. On the other side, where I was talking to those from the families from Pakistan-controlled Kashmir, I ended up speaking to Kashmiri nationalists who were fighting for independence from both Pakistan and India. And I heard about how the Pakistani state curbs their politics by preventing them from holding public office or fighting in elections, of the misuse of anti-terrorism laws in the region, and of how shelling between Indian and Pakistani armies impacts families sandwiched in between these posts, of mothers who've had to pick up chopped up body parts of their children, of children who've lost their mothers to such firing. And here again, I'm going to read rather than talk more about this. So this is an interview I did in Atmaqam, which is in Neelam Valley. And I was sitting with a young woman named Aisha, who had seen a lot of this firing, which was particularly escalated during the 1990s when India was accusing Pakistan of militancy and of militants infiltrating across the line of control. And as a result was shelling, and then the Pakistani army would shell as well. And these were families kind of caught in between this crossfire. And there are several other women in the room as well. And one of them was her tai, or her father's sister, her aunt. And she walked into the room holding a photograph of a young man. And she said to me, "Do you see this picture? This was my son. I would have been a martyr. I would have been a grandmother today, but if he was still alive, but he became a martyr. He was on the bypass going to work when a mortar shell hit him. A car raced over him right after and crushed him. I had to collect pieces of his flesh and bones in my hands so we could bury him. He was my nephew," Aisha's mother now speaks. "I had to shove some of the flesh back inside his body with my own bare hands so we could have his funeral. There were times, though, when the firing would continue for so many days that we couldn't even go outside and pick up the dead bodies of our loved ones. They would rot outside while we mourned inside the bunkers, without any food, without any water, sometimes for days." As she speaks, Aisha's mother sits sideways on the bed, dressed in a dark purple shalwar kameez, her head covered with a dupatta. "Sometimes, in an attempt to save ourselves, we would end up getting hurt," she says. "There was no schedule, no warning before the firing started. It would happen all of a sudden. I remember once my son was very hungry. We hadn't eaten in 3 days because the roads were shut due to the firing and no food supplies would reach our area. For a few hours, the firing stopped, and somehow I got my hands on some okra. I rushed to cook, and as soon as my son smelt the food, he ran for it. But all of a sudden, mortar shelling started, and my son panicked and slipped. He hit his head hard against the concrete. I dragged him inside the bunker, and for 3 hours, I put my hand on his wound to stop the bleeding. There was nothing else. There was no concept of first aid back then. It was always all of a sudden," adds Aisha. "For instance, back then, if we were sitting as we are right now, we'd all know that at the slightest sound, we would have to rush to the bunkers. I remember once there was a small lull in the firing and we were sitting on the steps right outside this room. We weren't allowed to go any further because of the threat of firing. My khala, or my maternal aunt, was holding my hair and combing it when a mortar hit a home nearby. There was such a loud bang that everything around us shook. I remember she yelled, 'Allah,' and grabbed me by my hair and dragged me inside the bunker, my hair still clenched in her hands." So these kind of stories are endless. I documented several of them, and during the course of me documenting these stories, which were then of the past, so firing used to be much more escalated during the 90s, and then in 2003 there was a ceasefire, and there was a little bit of a lull, but ceasefire violations remained common. And during the course of me writing and researching this book, they really escalated. Indian and Pakistani relations really soured after 2016, and firing returned to several of these villages. And so this kind of violence is ongoing in many ways, and violence continues to unfold in diverse ways within Kashmir. But what we hear, or what we see in the larger mainstream popular narratives in both nations, are not these voices, are not these experiences. Rather, both states continue to engage in the finger pointing, or this juxtapositioning of each other, this narrative making, which enables them to deflect attention from them. I'm going to switch gears quite so, and kind of move to a very different landscape, which is Canada, where I now live. I moved here back in 2019. Against the politically charged, the very violent narratives that I just shared with you, Canada, at least in popular imagination, is perceived as benign. It is a friendly, multicultural, welcoming place. It's a land of ice hockey and maple syrup. But this narrative too doesn't just emerge out of nowhere, and it doesn't just emerge in isolation. Canada's self-image and the way it is perceived by others is also based on comparison. The framing of Canada being welcoming emerges in juxtaposition to increasingly hostile borders and xenophobic immigration policies around the world. Canada emerges as welcoming in relation to or in comparison with those other places that are less welcoming or more hostile. I think one of the very interesting and very prevalent comparisons or juxtaposition within Canada, but also within the larger, global North, you can say, or the West, is this comparison with the global South. Canada is not alone. I'm going to argue that the US and much of the West looks at itself and defines itself against this comparison with the global South. And this global South is looked through, of course, not through a neutral lens, but rather through an Orientalist lens or a framework. And through this lens, places like South Asia, where I come from, or Africa, or much of the global South really, emerges as static places, fixed places that are simultaneously exotic and barbaric, magical and menacing. Through the Orientalist trope, people in these places are also imagined as uncivilized, poverty-ridden, illiterate, and in many ways desperate to be saved by the West. Now, in Canada, in 2022, just last year, over 400,000 immigrants entered. And the majority, if you look at the 10 main source countries from where immigrants come, a lot of them are developing countries. Philippines, Pakistan's part of them, Iran is there, India is there. Now, viewed from the Orientalist gaze, a static, homogeneous image of these home countries, of the places where many immigrants are coming from, emerges, against which immigration to Canada then becomes a story of gratitude, of hope, and I'm going to argue even of white saviorism. As a result, immigrants are automatically assumed to be better off by the virtue of just being in Canada, by just having landed there, they have to be better off. But the reality, if you kind of move away from this popular narrative, which I feel is very limiting, the reality is a lot more complicated. Currently, Canada is witnessing a historic decline in the number of permanent residents who are obtaining Canadian citizenship. There's actually been a 40% decline in citizenship uptake over the past 20 years. So looked at new data has come about. This is actually something that hasn't been tracked before. And now it's being tracked. And from 2001 to 2021, there's been a 40% decline in people availing and obtaining Canadian citizenship when they can. To really clarify what I mean here, these are people who've already uprooted themselves, left behind the only life that they know in their home countries and come to Canada to build a new life here. But after coming here, they're somehow deciding that living in Canada isn't actually that desirable. Analysts are still investigating what's happening because this is a very large decline, and it's very worrying because Canada, of course, relies heavily on immigrants for its economy. So root causes are still being looked at, but some of the big challenges facing immigrants and newcomers have long been known. They're kind of out there. They include immigrants, newcomers not getting hired because they don't have Canadian experience or Canadian credentials, being seen to have language problems, quote unquote, the fact that they may not be as fluent in English, not being seen as the right cultural fit. All of these create barriers to adequate employment. And the fact is that there's rising living cost in Canada. There's unaffordable housing. There's also racism in the job and housing market. And so odds are really stacked against newcomers, especially racialized immigrants. So while Canada's immigration policy may be more generous than other places in juxtaposition to other places, it's important to keep in mind that it isn't really open to everyone. Over half of recent immigrants to Canada have come under the economic category, which means that they're ranked and scored and cherry-picked as some of the most skilled from the pool. Many people I know personally, including some Ivy League graduates who've been to school in the US, exceptionally bright people, actually haven't qualified. But once those who are cherry-picked, once they are actually able to enter Canada, because they're deemed to have the right skills, what ends up happening is that the same skills that were seen as worthy enough for them to get into Canada are suddenly not seen as, they don't translate the same way. They're not suddenly seen as worthy enough for them to get hired, regardless of how skilled they might be. Thus, many newcomers find themselves having to either go back to school and requalify, which of course takes thousands of dollars and means you're not really able to earn at least full-time for your family, or they become underemployed, which is a huge problem, underemployment in Canada. So you have doctors, for instance, serving as Dollarama cashiers, journalists driving as Uber drivers, dentists working as concierge, and so on. In my own case, I have an undergrad degree from Canada, and then I moved back to Pakistan. Then I came back and I did my graduate studies from here. I also, because I lived in a post-colonial society, I studied in English. I consider English to be the language I'm most fluent in. I have cultural capital in that sense. I also had a network in Canada, but I had a very, very difficult time in the initial years. It took me over a year to actually land my first job here. And that also only happened after I took the word Pakistan off my resume. A lot of places I had worked for had Pakistan in their name, the organizations, Citizens Archive of Pakistan or Association for the Development of Pakistan. And eventually I started to use acronyms, and that's actually when I started to get my first interview calls. And I know this is not my story alone. I've worked in the settlement sector in Canada as well. I know this is a story of many, many people, personally seen doctors, highly skilled pediatricians with years and years, decades worth of experience trying to land a coordinator, a receptionist job, and not being able to do that either. So the situation is grave. And that's what makes me kind of wonder. I mean, this should raise alarm. These systemic issues are not new, but they remain pervasive. And I pause to ask, really, as Canada seeks to further boost immigration in the next few years, the government has said that this is its aim, it wants to boost it. We have to ask, how does it feel it can boost the immigration when these structural systemic challenges persist? What narratives or self-perceptions or beliefs enable this? In 2021, Ontario Premier Doug Ford commented that immigrants must be willing, and I quote here, to work their tail off. They can't just sit around and collect the dole. Ford was criticized heavily by many politicians for these words, but the fact is that such stereotypes continue to permeate and shape how immigrants are viewed. If one considers the Orientalist Western gaze on the places that most immigrants come from, this is not surprising to me. Through the Orientalist trope, immigrants are imagined as lazy. This lens also assumes that regardless of the experience in Canada, newcomers must be better off than they were in their home country, which again is imagined as a place of backwardness, of poverty, of illiteracy, and thus as desperate for citizenship. And it's true. There are so many push factors for immigrants. Many of them are, coming to escape poverty, instability, conflict. These are all realities. But the places immigrants come from are more complex than the fixed Orientalist gaze allows us to see. And the experiences here in Canada too are complex. It's not a simple upward journey. In fact, many people feel like they're actually taking a step back, especially as they combat structural challenges and racism in the housing and job market alongside rising living costs in Canada. Now, another comparison or juxtaposition that plays an essential part in the Canadian narrative is one with the US. Of course, I haven't lived in the US and I don't know enough about the context, but I do wonder if this is perhaps more unique and not reciprocated in the same way in the US, where the principle of US exceptionalism of being unique to everyone else is more central. But here in Canada, self-image is in very significant ways shaped by how Canada views the US. So here are some cartoons and memes. You see here on one side a banner that says welcome to Canada, on the other side not very welcome to the United States. You kind of see those polar opposite. One is a welcoming place to immigrants and refugees, and other is framed as not. Black Friday in the US, is shown as aggressive, violent, whereas in Canada, everybody's saying, I'm sorry, no, you're next, excuse me, after you. The Canadian mob is standing there but saying, I'm giving you one last chance to talk before we actually say, please talk. So that's a perception. And these memes are funny and, they're prevalent. But I think there's also a very serious undertone and a very serious kind of reality that they help obscure. And that is of racism, the racism problem within Canada. These comparisons with the US allow Canada to emerge as the less racist of the two, at least in popular imagination. Here's an image of Prime Minister Trudeau taking the knee at the Black Lives Matter demonstration. And this is, of course, at a time that racial violence in the US is in the spotlight after the killing of George Floyd. Now, this is a very symbolic gesture. I'm not taking away from that. But many Canadians also ask if and how these symbolic gestures are followed up with meaningful and systemic changes to address racism within Canada. A lot of Canadians feel that by finger pointing at the US or by seeing itself as less racist than the US, Canada gets a pass, both locally as well as globally. But the fact is that whether or not it is less or more racist, which I think is an absurd question to ask in the first place, racism is a very significant issue in Canada. And to give you a sense of what I'm talking about, I want to share some statistics. Racialized Canadians earn on average 81 cents to the dollar compared to other Canadians. Black males living in Toronto are 3 times more likely to be stopped and asked for identification by police. Employers are 40% more likely to interview a job applicant with an English-sounding name, despite identical education skills and experience. 27% of the federal prison population in 2017 were Indigenous people, who only comprise 4.1% of the Canadian population. 52% of Canadians, according to one survey, feel that Muslims can only be trusted a little or not at all. Black students are 4 times more likely to be expelled from a Toronto high school than white students. Black women are 3 times less likely to have a family doctor than non-racialized women in Ontario. Black residents are 20 times more likely than a white resident to be shot dead by police in Toronto. At the same time, a 2019 survey indicates nearly half of Canadians believe discrimination against Black people is no longer a problem, even as 83% of Black people in Canada say they're treated unfairly at least some of the time. So this is a question I ask myself, and I think we must ask ourselves. Is being worse than or better than good enough? Yes, comparisons can help us strive to achieve, to do better. They can be something that we look up to, we can aspire towards, but they can also create false equivalencies. They can also neutralize issues. One must ask, what does it mean to be less racist? Or going back to the case of Kashmir, having less or more human rights abuses. Does this quantification, this juxtaposition, give one nation a pass over the other? And what does it mean when the issues at hand are as grave as racism or human rights violations? Narratives are essential to the stories we want to tell ourselves about us and about those we see as the other, but they're also reductionist tropes, limiting us in our ability to both see the complexities in ourselves and others and preventing us from introspecting and creating real, meaningful, and systemic change. And that's why personally in my work, I feel it's so important to kind of understand and recognize the limits of these popular narratives and turn towards personal narratives or people's lived experience. In 2020, I co-founded a small artist collective based out of Canada by the name of Qissa, which loosely translates as story. It serves as a platform for immigrants to tell their own story in their own words, stories of connection, stories of rupture, stories untold. The belief behind Qissa is that storytelling lays the foundation of an emphatic and just society, that when people tell their own stories in their own words, it can be an empowering experience. We believe at Qissa that stories of immigrants are an integral part of the story of Canada, and that immigrants have to be the ones telling those stories. This initiative is very, very small at this point, but through the voices and through the narratives we've begun to collect, we get to hear about people's journey once they actually land in Canada, what happens, because the story we often hear in mainstream narratives is coming to Canada, that's the story, but what happens after you leave the airport? And we learned that that journey is a lot more complex than what popular narratives may tell us. Yes, people are grateful to be in Canada. Many of them are doing extremely, extremely well, but the journey isn't always easy nor always welcoming. In some of the interviews we've collected with the Sikh community, for instance, people who moved in the 1960s and 70s, we've learned about what it was like to be one of the first people in the city to be wearing a turban, of times when temples were attacked and people were subjected to racial slurs or physical violence. And the hope, of course, would be that from the 60s and 70s, these are stories of the past and things have improved. And yes, in some ways they absolutely have. But systemic racism continues to be embedded and institutionalized in many areas of Canadian society. I'm going to end here with, and we can get into question answer. I'm going to end here in the slightly paraphrased words of one of our interviewees at Qissa, because I think that really reminds me, as a constant reminder of the importance of turning towards people's lived experiences, their words, their stories, their personal narratives, and the limits of macro narratives. This is somebody who moved in the 60s. And he says, from 1961 to 2021, you yourself can count the months and days that have passed, but immigrants had difficulty finding jobs then, and they have difficulty now. Different political parties have come to power, but none of them have been able to dismantle systemic racism. No matter how many Sikhs, Hindus, or Muslims join the parliament, the situation won't change. Racism existed, it still exists, and it will continue to exist as it benefits a segment of society. The camouflage of multiculturalism tries to dilute how deeply racism is entrenched in Canada. It prevents us from dissecting how racism is embedded within Canada. It prevents us from asking how we as South Asians can be liberated if Indigenous people and Black Canadians are still oppressed. But during COVID-19, we saw that Indigenous communities, Black Canadians, and South Asians all had a higher rate of COVID-19 positivity. Until we take control of our narrative, we will continue to be discriminated. So I'll end there, and here's a slide with some resources. If you're interested in knowing more about Qissa or have somebody you'd like to nominate for an interview, please let us know. And if you're interested in learning more about what's happening in Kashmir, there are a few resources there, as well as a report on anti-Black racism in Canada. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. That was such an excellent talk. We've known each other for many years now, and I'm always humbled by the stories that you've heard and that you've shared with others. It's incredibly important that we hear these stories. So we move now to the question and answer portion of our program. Please submit your questions via the chat function at the bottom of your viewing screen. If you have not done so already, feel free to turn on your video function, but please do keep yourself muted. While we're waiting for questions to come in, ICFRC wants to thank its members and donors for their support. If you would like to join ICFRC or make a gift to support our programs, please go to icfrc.org. While we do wait for some questions to come in, maybe I can begin with one. Anam, you and I have talked about a lot of these issues, particularly as it applies to India and Pakistan. I'm thinking a lot about young people, and I'm wondering what you hear from high school age, college age students, and how they perceive these narratives of the other, the juxtaposition. And maybe it's easier to talk about what young people in Pakistan think about the narratives in India, and what maybe older generations tell them they're supposed to hear, compared to, what their own understanding is. These are narratives that are not my own, or are they their own narratives too, going forward? I think in the US, I'm heartened somewhat, maybe increasingly at times, I'm not sure, by my own students who seem to be more open-minded, who seem to be a little more critically inclined towards narratives of the other, broadly construed. But I'm wondering what you see. What is your own experience with young people? What are they telling you?
That's a great question. And, I think I've talked about this earlier, written about this as well. The common sense dictates that as you especially move further away from 1947, from the violence of partition, there's an opening, there's a space for younger people to form their own opinions, to maybe move away from that very violent history. But unfortunately, you don't necessarily see that at the ground level. I've had an opportunity to work both in Pakistani schools as well as speak to Indian students. I've gone across the border as well as through different virtual settings. And what happens is that I think the context is really important to remember. Most Indians and Pakistanis don't get a chance to meet each other. right? I've quoted this study a lot. Gallup Pakistan did one a few years ago, and they found that it's over 70% of Pakistanis have never met an Indian, and I assume that the number is as high on the other side. But India and Pakistan, because they have these very large narratives and they talk about each other so much, there's not a single Pakistani or Indian that I've met who doesn't think about the other, right? Especially in North India and in many parts of, Pakistan, like Punjab or Sindh. So in absence of getting to know each other, an absence of dialogue, an absence of that exposure, what ends up happening is that textbook narratives, jingoistic media debates kind of become the only narrative that you have access to. And so when I would first go into these classrooms, and I was running this exchange program for local nonprofit Citizens Archive, there was a lot of reluctance to engage in that exchange or to even talk to one another. They had heard stories and one-sided stories of violence, right? So depending on what side of the border you're at, you're only going to access certain narrative. And so these are kids who are saying, well, we heard they killed our ancestors. We don't want to be talking to them. And they have all of these misconceptions, right? But once they do get to talk, if they do have that opportunity, and there are a lot of wonderful programs, small scale, that are happening, you see that shift immediately. So this is one of my favorite stories, and I've shared this a lot, but I'll share it here again. I was talking to, I think it was 7th graders in a school in Mumbai, and I told them to ask me anything. And, they were very scared, but then they had questions about fundamentalism and terrorism and all of that. And after about 30, 40 minutes, an hour of our conversation, one of the students said, well, now I know not all Pakistanis are murderers. I can think of going there too. That's my 3-month-old at the back, if you can hear. Sorry about that. So yeah, I think that is the reality for a lot of people. Having said that, I don't think you can homogenize. I think depending on your social class, depending on your exposure, depending on your family history, there's a lot of nuance as well. So you do have a lot of people in the 3rd generation now of Pakistan, or 4th generation, people younger than me, getting curious about history. And what's really interesting, Peter, is that I found in my work that this hostility is increasing intergenerationally. But if you go back to partition survivors, they also remember that violence, it's personal for them, but they also remember a time when the other was not the other, right? That's not to create a romantic picture of the pre-partition past, because there were many fault lines, but there was also coexistence, a codependence, which you don't have now. So for the younger children, that's my concern. When we lose these personal stories, when we lose that, and we're left with our state narratives that are bent on otherizing, what are these children being left with, right? What kind of myopic, otherizing, dehumanizing lens do they have? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. A question, you compared the India versus Pakistan narratives and then moved to an examination of Canada and its treatment of minorities. Could you compare and contrast Pakistan's treatment of its minorities versus Canada and its treatment of its minorities?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. And the thing with comparisons is that, the landscapes are so different. And dynamics are so different that sometimes my concern is always what gets lost when we make these comparisons. Now, Pakistan, when you look at the conditions of minorities right now, this is work that I've done personally. I've actually, done interviews with the Hindu minority, the Sikh minority, the Christian minority, the Zoroastrian minority as well. That violence is very structural, and that violence is also very physical. You see that, when I say that there's anti-Indian sentiment, I think it's important to qualify that also very quickly translates as anti-Hindu sentiment. So in post-partition years, what's happened is that nationalisms have become synonymous with religious identity. So India is seen as Hindu India, Pakistan is seen as Muslim Pakistan, and the repercussions for minorities then are really, really grave. So every time there's tension between India and Pakistan, Hindu minorities in Pakistan, for instance, will come under fire. Temples may get attacked, right? Hindu families may get attacked. So that violence is very visceral. It's very, very physical. There are issues of forced conversion. There are issues within laws as well. So laws that discriminate against religious minorities, particularly Ahmadis, who are declared as non-Muslim. So they're within your bureaucracy, they're within your laws, they're structural in that sense, and they also unfold in this kind of very physical violence. And of course, when you have children who are, let's say, from a Hindu family going into schools and studying from these textbooks which otherize them, right? It's very, very personal. There are stories of, teachers kind of having very blatant biases and prejudice and taking that all out on those children, asking them quite absurd questions about their religion, about their identity, from a fifth grader, from a sixth grader. So I think those are the kinds of experiences that minorities have in Pakistan. They're of course complex based on your social class, your geography. Those things will have an impact. Gender will have an impact. So forced conversions particularly affect women. And in Canada, as I mentioned, it's very different. I mean, you see physical violence here as well. In 2021, we had the very horrific incident of an entire family, Muslim family, being run over, because they were Muslim. Essentially, you have instances of people's beards being, ripped. It's physical. It's very much physical, and it also operates at a structural level through, discrimination in jobs. Now, if I ask myself this question, if 52% of Canadians feel they cannot trust a Muslim, what happens when you see my name on a resume? How does that translate in the job market? How does that translate in the education system? Right, and this is something that I'm still learning because I'm still very new here. The narratives that I've started to record are also more recent. But I think the issue is very, very pervasive and it's very institutionalized, which worries me. So again, very different dynamics, very different ways in which it unfolds, very different targets as well, but a lot of parallels there about how essentially, who we see as the other gets subjected to and gets scapegoated as well, to these kinds of attacks, which can be physical, but also much more subtler and vicious.
Maybe we'll end with this last question sent to me. You've described some really difficult and unfortunate, tragic circumstances in South Asia and in North America. The question is, what gives you hope and optimism for the future?
Well, that's a difficult question. I think for me, it's really the power of these oral histories. I'm going to come back to that because I feel there is so much value to them, and I've had my own unlearning process. So I say this from a very personal experience. I grew up with the same narrative about India. I grew up with the same narrative about Pakistan. I grew up with that otherization as well. Right. And it is only through this work that I've had the opportunity to do that I really stumbled upon, that I've started to unlearn and realize the importance of unlearning. And then I've been working with school children and I've seen the impact that it can have on them as well. So I think the more we are able to move away from these larger macro narratives that are very jingoistic often and go back to people's lived experiences and archive that. That's what I really feel I need to do urgently is document as many stories as I can, because I think that's where you'll say, wait a moment, this is what I heard, but this is a little bit more complex. This is a little bit more nuanced. And these stories have the power to really humanize. So that's what gives me hope. And it gives me hope because I've seen the impact on children, right? Like, as I mentioned, there's so many other experiences I've had like that, where you enter a room and there's hostility. And by the time you leave, words have power, stories have power. And then you see lasting change. So that's what gives me hope. Thank you for asking that question.
Yeah, thank you, Anam. I couldn't agree more. I think we need more useful complication of the world in which we live, that it's not this or that. It's really not that simple, and more critical learning. Learning, and as you pointed out, some unlearning and relearning too. Thank you so much, Anam, for your excellent presentation. This was ICFRC's 11th program for the spring semester. Our next program, next week, Wednesday at 6:30 p.m., will be held at Film Scene in Iowa City and features a screening of the documentary TikTok Boom and a virtual Q&A with filmmaker Shalini Kantaya. All attendees will receive a free small popcorn. How about that? Do make sure to reserve your seat on Film Scene's website. For more information, check out icfrc.org/events calendar. Thank you for joining us today, and We are adjourned.